So I am going to pick up on a few themes that we included in our plenary session to highlight, I think, specifically for the broader discussion. And so I will flip through a few of these slides rather quickly, but this process of valuing has been with us for a long period of time, building a more precise discipline, including a conference that started here in Manchester in the early 90s. Can we price our countryside? I wrote a piece for the Landscape Press on green values from research. I refer to parks an awful lot because it's about creating and maintaining value, but there's a picture here of Princes Park in Liverpool. Paxton designed it, Richard Vaughan Yates was a developer. The interest here is that value of landscape was used to create the development in the first place, and then subsequently proximity to that landscape. So the value of the proximity was also used as a means to fund the management and maintenance. So I think in natural capital accounting, that relationship between landscape and value is important and has some opportunities to explore, particularly to tackle some of the challenges of funding and maintaining our urban green infrastructure. Here's a picture of Birkenhead Park, the boathouse. And at that time, there was a select committee which emphasised the public health value of parks. Okay? This last year, the boathouse is still standing at Birkenhead. It's very nice to see. But it is slightly Groundhog Day for parks because we've now had, at the beginning of this year, another select committee extolling the health benefits of parks and the potential of creating health and well-being strategies and park strategies. We've got to move on from just highlighting health values to starting to articulate them. So my second point is about how do we drill into the health benefits in more detail so that we can actually take it beyond just extolling the health virtues and use it as a strategic planning and design tool. How's that been done? I am going to give you a few references. So Centre for City Park Excellence in the 90s produced some really interesting studies for individual parks and park systems in the States on measuring the economic value of city parks. So Centre for City Park Excellence, the work was done by Peter Harnick, may be familiar with many of you, but the process looked at individual parks and park systems. So here for Boston, as you look at that list of the annual value of Boston Park and Recreation System summary includes under the green headings direct use value and health values, which you start seeing as substantial. So starting to play around with those figures. And here we're at 2008. A study for an individual park, which I think is the best detailed assessment of the value of a specific park, this case Millennium Park Chicago, looked at quadruple net value, economic, social, environmental and experiential values. Health was tucked into that in a good amount of detail. I'm going to scoot on from this. This is, if you're an anorak of the subject, start with Costanza's paper in Nature, The Value of the World's Ecosystem Services and Natural Capital. I think this is where the discipline really started and got going, and it was really, it's a really interesting and ambitious study. It's easy to get off the web. I've talked about the Tacoma Park study, which I think was the first one for me looking around, really started to quantify ecosystem services and natural capital. The blue section looks at health, which is what John and I think, have been interested in trying to explore, particularly on the back of the Select Committee report that we've had published at the end of January. It has a great lot of tables, won't go into in detail now, but they take each of those, so if you just pop back, each of those headings there, carbon sequestration, stormwater, we've heard a lot about them, but it starts unpacking the way those are measured. And so for health, a set of metrics which then feed across to the overall total annual value. If you look at it in low terms, 22 million per annum across all the elements, 9 million, so almost half is attributed to health cost reduction benefits. We've referenced a bit the natural capital accounting and the methodology that FTech has prepared. So this is a slide I will scoot through rather swiftly, but it is the discipline that we've been trying to use as a methodology with our work in Barnet and Dagenham. And so just a couple more slides. This is a report that we published before the end of the year, probably in the next couple of months. So it's a study by FTech, commissioned by DEFRA. I've had a small role to play in terms of looking at the value, particularly of urban food growing through allotments, but it's about the scope of natural capital accounts for urban environment, which wasn't done in detail in the UK National Ecosystem Assessment, which set out a section on the urban environment, but now this is starting to be unpacked. So for our urban green infrastructure, I think it'll be an interesting one to look at. No time here to go through table, but in terms of the content of that natural capital and how that can influence it, and the middle columns are where the empirical research sits. So wait for this to come out, but this will give us a bit more of the detail. I finish with this slide, which is the study by Robin Smale, Vivid Economics, back to Sheffield. And the interesting thing here is I'm going to only highlight one thing, which is the green table for you bottom left. The health values are a high driver for return on ecosystem services. So when you look at physical health benefit of 43% and mental health benefit of 12%, you've got 55%. Over half of the value of Sheffield's park service can be attributed to benefits for public health. So I think, for me to conclude very swiftly, I think it is interesting to see that we can start using this as a means to articulate and quantify in a good level of, or an increasingly robust level of detail, those points made by the Select Committee about public health. And it's something that John and I have been trying to explore in a bit more detail with Barking and Dagenham. So at that point, I pass over to John.
Thank you. I just want to add a little bit of granularity to the presentation I gave a few moments ago on the natural capital accounting process, just to help you to understand the data sets that we reference in building up the account. So maybe this is something we can discuss when I finish the presentation. I think it's quite interesting. I think one of the interesting things about about today for us is looking at the other work that people are doing on natural capital accounting or natural capital generally, and looking at the work that, for instance, Vivid are doing and other studies. What's interesting is that there is no common practice yet. This is really emerging practice. The data sets aren't consistent. Some of them are, some of them aren't. What's consistent is the result, i.e. that the benefits always seriously outstrip the cost of sustaining those benefits. That's the key message. I hope it came across before. 13 to 1, 4 to 1 in the case of both the studies we've done. That's what we find across every study that anybody's doing. So it is a refining process, but I just wanted to run through how we did it, and then you can maybe interrogate that when we go through this. So just to look at what we did in Barnet in a bit more detail. So here's a selection of sites in Barnet. They're classified according to the London Plan typology for open spaces, according to size fundamentally, and then they're assessed in the context of the UK Ecosystem Assessment of 2011 for quality. And that's what gives us the Natural Capital Asset Register, which is the first building block of developing the account. Looking at the value of visits, we use a tool called ORVAL. And ORVAL references the monitor of engagement with the national environment, which is an ongoing study of use of green space across the UK, using a sample, basically a weekly poll of a sample segment of the population, looking at how they access and use the natural environment. And that ORVAL tool is used to build up this valuation around what the total value of visits to Barnet's green spaces is. The interesting thing about ORVAL is that it excludes children under 16. A key constituency as far as parks use is concerned. So returning to this theme of whether or not our natural capital values are an underestimate, again, because we're excluding children from this calculation, it's likely these figures are going to be much higher. We use UK Active's statistics in terms of looking at the value of avoided health benefits accruing from the use of green space. So according to UK Active's statistical base, 26% of the borough's population is inactive. That costs the borough £17 million a year in terms of direct health costs and loss of economic capacity to the borough. And we can work that back to a cost per individual inactive person of £178. Multiplying that forward to the number of people who are actually engaged in green space, then we can work out that the actual avoided cost of getting those people active would be £19 million. That's what goes in to the account. So again, it's the use of a UK-wide statistical base to provide the data to build up the account.
Is that annually? That's cost per annum?
Per annum, yeah. Don't want to get too political, but just to kind of contradict Theresa May, there is such a thing as a magic money tree. Cave's known this for a very long time. It's called the park. And actually modelling the uplift of capital value of property in the proximity of a park is well established, but it's quite a variable process, and it's quite labour intensive. In the Barnet context, we modelled the impact of parks on capital value of property for 5 spaces only. But even within that context, that very limited sample, 5 out of 199 parks, the value to property within the catchment of those parks alone was up to £140 million. So multiply that considerably to capture all the value that accrues from every single park in Barnet. Again, it's a very significant underestimate. Carbon sequestration is based on the government's approach to estimating what the sequestration value of different ecosystem types is. So it's just basically taking the amount of each particular ecosystem identified in the 2011 ecosystem assessment and multiplying that by the government's multiplier. The interesting thing about the account generally is that it excludes the value of flood risk mitigation, the value of pollution mitigation, the value of urban warming mitigation, and the value of biodiversity resilience. Not from any sense a deliberate act on our part, it's just that these benefits, these values, are not modelled with sufficient reliability for us to be able to include it in the account. But this is an emerging practice, and in time we'll have a more resilient approach to how we measure those benefits, and we can include them in the account as we go forward. I don't want to dwell too much on Barking Dagenham because the methodology was the same, but there's just one area of work that we've subsequently delivered in Barking Dagenham which is of interest, and that's looking at the correlation between health and park provision and park quality. On the left-hand side, the red and the yellow, the more red, the worse the parks, and the more green, the better they are. The slide on the right shows the incidence of childhood obesity across Barking Dagenham. Barking Dagenham has got the worst obesity statistics in the whole of England, and we're not just talking about children, we're talking about everybody. It is a major health issue, and there is a direct correlation between quantum of open space provision and quality of public open space provision. So in terms of this call to arms, in terms of the need to invest in green infrastructure to address fundamental health issues, here is some very strong evidence, and this is something we're pursuing through their Healthy Towns pilot as kind of ongoing work. And it's particularly interesting looking at the population growth in Barking Dagenham that I discussed earlier, 48% rise between now and 2041. In the affected boroughs, i.e. those ones across the southern edge of the borough, that population increase will result in 2 million additional visits to parks and open spaces, potentially. And that would bring in between £200,000 and £800,000 of direct health benefits across the borough as a consequence of those park visits taking place. So again, in terms of making the case for investment in green infrastructure, here is the direct evidence of the health benefits and the savings to the NHS of having good quality green infrastructure that's attractive for people to use. Thank you.